Hey, this is Dr. Tromble, and today I want to talk about a coaching session and really a general topic that I'm really passionate about, and that's diet composition. Let's take a minute and just review the history of what's been recommended for patients as far as like what they should eat. And we'll take a minute to think about what's been recommended and then how that may differ from what's maybe effective and what's being recommended today. So patients for the last 20 years have been really educated to look for foods that are low in fat. But when you start to really investigate what those foods are, what you find is that those foods that are low in fat are actually very high in sugar. And so we look around at the epidemic of obesity in America amongst other countries, and we see that clearly the low-fat diet has not been an effective strategy in helping millions of people who have really invested effort in meeting their goals. So our body is designed to be a lot like a caveman. You hear a lot about the word paleo style diet, which is really a kind of a catchphrase that describes a diet that's really high in protein and plant-based resources. So with the paleo style diet, basically it's a hunter-gatherer type of way of accessing food. So the reason why that's important is it's going to emphasize foods that are rich in healthy fats and high in protein while minimizing simple sugars and carbohydrates. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important. It's not that all carbohydrates are the enemy, but there's a reason why carbs today may be different than the carbohydrates of even 50 to 100 years ago. So carbohydrates today are mass produced, they're genetically modified, and so these modifications of carbohydrates lead to much different end products in our body. And it happens to be that many of the products that are high in carbohydrates in the American diet also tend to be filled with preservatives and other chemicals that are just simply unhealthy. So at Med1, our healthy transformation and our other protocols, we use a high protein diet that's rich in healthy fats, and we try to minimize carbohydrates. So what do carbohydrates actually do in our body, and why are they not helpful? So when carbs come into our digestive tract, they lead to a natural response, and that response is not the problem, but the excessive response is. And so carbohydrates come into the body and they trigger insulin release, and insulin is a hormone that comes from your pancreas, and insulin is really important in allowing that blood sugar that's been ingested to go into cells to run cellular reactions and fuel metabolism. So when carbohydrates are in excess, the amount of insulin that is required to cause that blood sugar to enter cells is much, much greater. And when an insulin is in excessive concentrations, the insulin leads to some other processes that are probably outside of our scope today, but lead to abdominal fat storage, and that fat also can accumulate in organs. So by minimizing the amount of blood sugar and the amount of blood glucose that our body is exposed to, we are able to minimize the insulin spike that can lead to some of the deleterious effects that I just mentioned. When we shift our metabolism to require energy sources that are different than blood sugar, we find that for the amount of expenditure, we actually burn more calories and trim our bodies more effectively. So using fat and protein as a primary source of fuel for our cells is a much more effective way of deriving energy. So there's a couple of things that I mentioned just chemically about about carbohydrates. The other thing about carbs that I think is interesting is it explains why carbs have such an impact in our brain. So it's unlike other types of fuel, carbohydrates have a major reinforcing impact in the brain. They've studied the influence of carbohydrates on brain physiology, and they have found that carbohydrates act a lot like other addictive substances in our brain. And so there's a reason why we call it comfort food, and it's because carbohydrates can lead to release of some feel-good chemicals such as serotonin and dopamine, which can be rewarding to our brain. And so our brain becomes somewhat addicted to that immediate feel-good reserve. And in some people, this can be really influential and it can drive their behavior. So for a lot of reasons, partly because of the way that we were designed and because of the types of food that are low in carbs and higher in protein and in healthy fats, those foods tend to be fresh, they tend to be clean, and overall just much more nutrient dense than those foods that are processed or high in simple carbohydrates. And so here at Med1, and as reflected in our Healthy Transformation Program, we support a program that promotes that type of